Imagine a continent where the horizon stretches endlessly, and through its barren emptiness runs something bizarre. An impossibly straight line etched across the land, like the mark of some ancient titan. When people spot it on satellite images of Australia, speculation runs wild. Some whisper of secret military zones, others of hidden gateways to Antarctica or lost cities frozen in time. A few even claim it's the edge of the flat Earth. But the real story behind these fences is far stranger, and it all starts with a small, fluffy creature weighing barely a kilogram. In the late 1800s, a handful of European rabbits, just 24, were brought to Australia by a settler nostalgic for hunting. What followed was ecological mayhem. The rabbits reproduced at an unimaginable pace. Within 50 years, they numbered in the hundreds of millions, overrunning the continent like a living flood. They devoured native vegetation, stripped forests bare, and triggered the collapse of entire food chains. Animals starved, plant species vanished, and vast tracts of fertile land turned to desert. The country had no choice. It needed a wall. But this wasn't just a fence. It was a mad, desperate engineering feat that slashed across deserts, grasslands, and hills. A barrier so long it could rival the Great Wall of China. At first, it stood only 90 centimeters tall. That barely slowed the rabbits. They leapt over it, dug under it, squeezed through. So it was raised, reinforced, topped with barbed wire, but still they came. Then came an unexpected twist. The fence turned out to help against more than just rabbits. Out in the wild, Australia's livestock faced another predator, the dingo. These wild dogs hunted at night, not to feed but in a frenzy. A single pack could slaughter dozens of sheep in one spree. The farmers were desperate. When the fence began to slow the dingoes, it was a game-changer. It even deterred emus, the massive native birds with a taste for crops. What had begun as a rabbit barricade was evolving into a defense system for an entire way of life. But in Australia, no ecological crisis stays alone for long. The next invader? Cane toads. Imported in the 20th century to deal with beetles, the toads ignored their assigned task and instead launched an aggressive conquest of their own. In Europe, they're endangered. In Australia, they're an army. So once again, the response was familiar. Build another fence. This time, a 9-kilometer-long concrete wall, partially buried to stop the toads from digging through. Because, unlike rabbits, these invaders didn't leap, they tunneled. And then came the cats. Domestic cats, once pets, had gone feral. Now numbering over 20 million, they turned into lethal nighttime hunters. Scientists estimate they kill over 3 million animals every single day. Birds, reptiles, mammals, an ecological massacre unfolding silently each night. The solution? Yet another mega fence. 44 kilometers long, 3 meters high, designed to keep one of nature's most efficient predators away from protected species. Today, Australia's fencing efforts have entered the digital age. Some regions are testing virtual fences, devices that detect wildlife and emit sounds and lights to deter them from crossing roads. These invisible barriers have already reduced animal-vehicle collisions by 50%. They're cheaper, more efficient, and easier to install than traditional solutions. From space, Australia looks like a patchwork of wild land and human regret. The theories about secret government zones might be entertaining, but the reality is much more surreal. This is a country still trying to fix the chaos it unleashed with its own hands. Every fence is a reminder, a scar across the land, marking a battle between human error and natural balance. In Australia, when something goes wrong, the answer has always been the same. Build a bigger fence. By the time 2018 rolled around, the fence that was meant to keep feral cats out had finally been completed. And while the situation somewhat stabilized, the damage was already profound. Biologists estimated that feral cats had driven at least 27 native species to extinction. But this wasn't just a story about fences stopping predators. It became something darker, something deeper. As fences multiplied across the continent, unintended consequences began to surface. Many animals found themselves cut off, trapped in ecological bubbles. Migration, a basic survival strategy for countless species, was no longer an option. Animals that once roamed freely in search of food or refuge during droughts and wildfires were now running into steel walls. In some places, you can find their remains, skeletons tangled in wire or lying in the dust near the fence line. Dingoes, kangaroos, wallabies, all victims of invisible borders they could no longer cross. But the most unsettling effect of all wasn't physical, it was evolutionary. By splitting predator and prey with barriers, Australia had unknowingly begun altering the course of natural selection itself. In regions protected from predators like dingoes, scientists noticed kangaroos were growing up slower, staying smaller. Generations of kangaroos once needed to grow strong and fast to survive dingo attacks. But now, in fenced-off zones where the only predators left were foxes, the pressure to adapt faded. If this continues for decades, the kangaroos on one side of the fence may become fundamentally different from their cousins beyond it. Smaller, slower, more fragile. And if the fences were ever removed, these docile animals wouldn't stand a chance. Rabbits, cats, toads, they're just the beginning. These are only early warnings of how a single invasive species can throw an entire continent off balance. Imagine if Europe or Asia started fencing off individual species. What forests might be gone now? What animals erased from existence? Australia's story is a lesson in how ecological chaos can start with a single well-intentioned mistake and spiral into something irreversible. Even the land itself has changed. South of one major fence, researchers discovered a subtle but startling difference in the shape of the sand dunes. Without dingoes in the area, populations of invasive predators like foxes and feral cats exploded. These animals decimated the small marsupials and rodents that once fed on the seeds of native plants. With fewer seed eaters, more shrubs grew. Those shrubs created shade, and in turn, shaded plants began to thrive. The new vegetation stabilized the sand, slowed down the shifting dunes, and over time even altered their height and form. What began as a fence for rabbits ended up reshaping the terrain itself. Give it another few decades, and who knows? Maybe the dunes will birth entire new ecosystems. The cultural impact didn't go unnoticed either. Australia's rabbit-proof fence became the symbolic center of a powerful film titled Rabbit-Proof Fence, based on a true story. In 1931, 3 young Aboriginal girls escaped from a government institution and embarked on a harrowing journey to return home. With no maps, they followed the fence, walking for weeks across harsh landscapes, guided only by a line built to stop rabbits. The irony couldn't be deeper. A barrier designed to control nature became a lifeline for 3 children fighting their own captivity. But Australia's battle with animals didn't end with rabbits or cats. In fact, one of the strangest chapters in its history involved an animal now celebrated as a national symbol, the emu. After World War I, Australian veterans were given farmland in the country's west. Wheat was the crop of choice, and in preparation, the government expanded fencing to protect against rabbits. But in the 1930s, as the Great Depression hit, another problem appeared. Tens of thousands of emus migrating to the coast during breeding season found these farmlands directly in their path. The fences meant nothing to the emus. Tall, strong, and determined, they tore through the barriers and began feeding on the ripe wheat fields. Around 20,000 birds swept through the region like a feathered storm. Farmers were desperate. Rabbits poured through the same breaches the emus had created. Crops were ruined. In a panic, farmers begged the government for help. In an unprecedented move, the military was deployed. In 1932, Australian soldiers arrived in the outback armed with machine guns, mounted on trucks, and even supported by film crews expecting a clean and decisive victory. Instead, what followed was a surreal and humiliating campaign. The rains came just as the military arrived, scattering the birds and making travel near impossible. When the soldiers finally engaged the emus, the birds proved to be incredibly agile and well-organized, splitting into small, fast-moving groups that outmaneuvered the trucks and dodged bullets. Over the course of a week, more than 2,500 rounds were fired, with fewer than 50 confirmed kills. Headlines mocked the mission. Back in Canberra, politicians were furious. The army retreated, but the emus weren't done. They returned to the fields in even greater numbers, emboldened, as if taunting the humans. A second wave of military attacks followed, with slightly better results, about 1,000 birds killed, but at a cost of over 10,000 bullets. The operation became a national joke, And the Defence Minister, George Pearce, earned a new title in the press, the Minister of the Emu War. Soldiers later complained that the bird's dense feathers made it hard to hit their vital organs, and their erratic movement made clean shots nearly impossible. For all their firepower and planning, the humans were outclassed by birds. It's a strange piece of history, but one that fits perfectly into Australia's ongoing battle with its own wild kingdom. A land of walls and wildlife, of unintended consequences, and of creatures that refuse to be fenced in. Astonishingly, the emus continued to move at impressive speeds, even when wounded. Reports emerged of birds dashing through fields despite injuries that would have downed most animals. The media had a field day. Newspapers and television segments openly mocked the so-called Great Emu War. Public frustration grew louder, and soon the affair became an international embarrassment. British wildlife advocates launched protests against the slaughter, accusing the Australian government of attempting to wipe out a rare species. Prominent ornithologists worldwide condemned the campaign as reckless and unethical. In Australian Parliament, the ridicule escalated. One member sarcastically asked if medals would be awarded for participation in the conflict, and suggested, with biting irony, that the only true victors deserving of honour were the emus themselves. Meanwhile, officials debated who should cover the cost of the wasted ammunition, while the birds just kept coming, trampling through wheat fields and spreading further chaos. Things got so desperate that, at one point, some farmers proposed aerial bombardment of the emu flocks, a plan that, unsurprisingly, was denied. In the end, the government handed responsibility back to the people. After formal negotiations, a civilian campaign was approved, and local authorities began offering rewards for every emu taken down. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of birds were culled over the following months. Fences were reinforced and redesigned to resist the emu onslaught. Eventually, the conflict quieted, and by the late 1990s, the very same wild emus found themselves under state protection as a valued species. It's the kind of story you'd expect to see turned into a wild Netflix original, a nation losing a war against birds only to end up protecting them decades later. But emus, cane toads, dingoes, and kangaroos are just a small sample of the life forms roaming the Australian wilderness. And truth be told, they're not even the most dangerous. Because in Australia, danger often hides where you least expect it. Like in the plants. Here, even the flora can be a threat. Take the bunya pine, for example. This massive tree drops enormous cones weighing several kilograms, heavy enough to cause serious injury. Locals sometimes joke you should wear a helmet just to walk beneath them. Then there's the terrifying fact that over 2,000 plant species native to Australia are considered toxic or outright deadly. One particularly sinister example: the strychnine tree. Its fruit looks deceptively like a sweet persimmon, but consuming it can cause seizures, paralysis, and even death. The seeds are packed with strychnine, yes, the same lethal compound once used in poisons and old spy stories. And if you think nettles are harmless, think again. Australia is home to the gympie gympie, a plant that looks soft, almost inviting, with heart-shaped leaves dusted in fine, silky hairs. But those hairs are actually tiny, needle-like spines loaded with one of the most excruciating toxins known to science. Once embedded in the skin, the spines can cause unbearable pain that lasts for weeks, or even months. Worse still, they're nearly impossible to remove entirely. Touch the affected area later, expose it to sunlight or water, and the agony flares back up. These microscopic hairs can even float in the air. That means you don't even need to touch the plant to fall victim. Inhaling just a few of them may cause coughing, sneezing, eye irritation, and, in severe cases, life-threatening allergic reactions. Strangely enough, there's one animal that thrives on this botanical nightmare: the red-legged pademelon. This small kangaroo-like marsupial, barely half a meter tall, happily munches down entire gympie bushes without so much as a flinch. Evolution clearly has favorites. And then there's the crab's eye vine, a plant so lethal it makes poison ivy look like a snack. Inside its seed pods are glossy red seeds containing abrin, a toxin 30 times more potent than ricin. Ingesting even a tiny amount can cause vomiting, bloody diarrhea, severe dehydration, hallucinations, and organ failure. Death, if untreated, is a very real possibility. Even plants that look harmless, like the yellow jasmine or mangrove milk trees, can cause respiratory issues, temporary blindness, or violent stomach upset. The danger isn't always obvious. Often it's beautiful, blooming, and deadly. So what do experts recommend? Rule number 1, just because a bird can eat it, doesn't mean you can. Birds digest things humans can't. If you're truly stranded and must forage, start cautiously. Crush a small amount of the plant's leaf or stem and rub it on a sensitive patch of your skin, like the inside of your elbow. If no reaction occurs after a few minutes, try touching it lightly to your tongue. Any burning or tingling? Spit it out. If not, chew and spit. Only after several hours without symptoms should you consider actually swallowing a small amount. Even then, boil it and eat sparingly. Think of it less like food and more like a slow, suspicious medicine. But if you think danger stops on land, you're mistaken. At least plants stay in one place. They don't chase you. Not yet anyway. Australia's waters, however, are another story. And the creatures lurking there? Smaller, stranger, and sometimes deadlier than anything on land. Let's return to the waters of Australia, where even a casual swim can become a life-altering experience. Just ask 16-year-old Sam Canizet. One warm afternoon, while wading at a local beach, Sam felt a series of light pinpricks on his legs. At first, he assumed it was just the cold water or perhaps irritation from sand. But when he stepped onto the shore and looked down, what he saw nearly made him faint. His legs were covered in dozens of bleeding punctures. The wounds wouldn't stop bleeding. He rushed home, and when his parents couldn't get the bleeding under control, they took him to the hospital. Doctors treated Sam successfully, but the mystery remained: what had attacked him? Marine biologists eventually reached a consensus. It was a swarm of tiny sea creatures known as marine lice, small crustaceans that normally feed on the tissue of fish and other sea animals. In rare cases, they'll latch onto humans as an opportunistic snack. Sam's case was unusual, but not unprecedented. Yet marine lice are far from the most terrifying thing lurking in Australia's coastal waters. Much more feared is a creature so small, so ghost-like, that it eluded science for years. Locals once blamed a supernatural force, and they weren't entirely wrong. The Irukandji jellyfish, named after an Aboriginal tribe who believed a malevolent sea spirit caused sudden deaths in their coastal waters, is one of the deadliest animals in the world. The mystery of the Irukandji dates back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when people, often children, began dying suddenly while swimming at Queensland beaches. Death came swiftly, often without warning. Cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, overwhelming pain. Doctors were baffled. No sting marks, no visible wounds, just lifeless bodies and terrified families. It wasn't until 1955 that the mystery began to unravel. After a particularly tragic case involving a young swimmer, Australian doctor and biologist Hugo Flecker launched an emergency investigation. He ordered lifeguards to net everything in the water near the site of the incident. Among the catch, alongside fish, seaweed, and shrimp, was a small, nearly invisible jellyfish. It didn't look like much. But under ultraviolet light, Flecker finally saw it for what it was: completely transparent, shaped like a tiny cube, and hanging from its corners were delicate clusters of tentacles. He had discovered a member of the box jellyfish family, deadly, fast, and nearly impossible to detect with the naked eye. Unlike typical jellyfish that drift passively, box jellyfish can swim with purpose. Some species have up to 60 tentacles, extending nearly 5 meters, forming a lethal net in the water. The microscopic cells on their tentacles, nematocysts, are biological weapons, firing venom upon contact. And the pain? Instant and indescribable. So why did many victims show no wounds? In its resting state, the jellyfish's tentacles are just a few centimeters long. But during a hunt, they can rapidly extend several meters. If a swimmer brushes against a well-fed jellyfish, they might only receive a small sting, barely visible. But that tiny burn can still be fatal. Its venom is a chemical cocktail. Tetramine numbs the nerves, thalassin breaks down blood vessels and compromises breathing. Hypnotoxin overwhelms the nervous system. As little as 0.4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight can be deadly for an adult human, which means even the briefest contact with an active tentacle can lead to heart failure within minutes. Beaches in Queensland now display warnings every year between October and March, the season when irukandji are most active. But beachgoers still swim. So scientists developed a workaround: protection by deception. Turns out, these jellyfish don't recognize nylon as a living material. Their venomous cells don't activate on synthetic fabric. So lifeguards began wearing full-body nylon stockings in the water. It looked ridiculous, but it worked. Soon, entire stinger suits were developed for the public, covering swimmers from head to toe. They're now a standard part of the beachside safety kit. And yet, stories like these barely scratch the surface of Australia's wild, deadly natural world. There are dozens more: unknown predators, strange sea creatures, and toxic plants just waiting to be explored. If you're curious, let us know in the comments. We've got more material ready to go. Because beyond the fences, beyond the dunes and deserts, beyond even the box jellyfish, there's another mystery catching fire on the internet. A wall in Antarctica, guarded by silence, where expeditions go and never return. But that's a story for another time. And trust us, you'll want to hear it. That's enough for today. Be sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. See you soon.